Hello, everyone, and welcome to a new episode of our podcast at Queen Design. Remember, you can follow us on YouTube, Spotify, Instagram, LinkedIn, and whichever channels social media channels that you use. Today, we have Chris Jofeh with us, and it's uh, it's for me it's a very important podcast because Chris is someone I learned a lot from back in I think 2014, 15, 16, something around that. We can talk about that later, Chris. And I met Chris as a structure engineer at Arup, and we worked together on a very important project in London, the post building. And for me, and I refer to this, Chris, I didn't mention this to you before the podcast, but to me, that was like a master in structure design because of the complexity of the building and the different elements that were there. And working with you for a couple of years or three, I can't remember how long it was. It really, it really taught me a lot about structure. So thank you for that.
Oh, thank you.
And but today we are here to talk about also about the background, but something is slightly different because you've been working on decarbonisation, particularly in Wales, over the last few years. So I think it would be good to start with that because I think you recently been working on the roadmap to decarbonize the existing homes in Wales. So I think it would be good if you can start telling us what that is, and then we can take it from there.
Okay, thank you, Ron. Until recently, I was chairing an independent group that advised Welsh Government on decarbonising the existing housing stock. A few years back, 2019, we gave them some policy advice, and they actually followed some of that advice quite well. There's still a few things they could do, but anyway, they did follow the big items in there. More recently, they asked the group to give them a route map for the decarbonisation of the housing stock in Wales. And we issued that to them in April. The route map really defines the problem we're trying to solve, which is that the houses emit far too much carbon, and identifies the long-term goal, which is to get to net zero in the complete housing stock in Wales. And then it identifies the short and medium term outcomes that you need to achieve in order eventually to achieve your final goal. So we've defined that to them, and that is the route map, the short and medium term outcomes. We also looked to the action plan, which now needs to follow the route map. I mean, it precedes it in terms of what you do, but it follows it in terms of what you write. And the action plan will identify then to achieve all those outcomes who needs to do what by when, so that those short and medium term outcomes are achieved, and we eventually do decarbonise the entire Welsh housing stock. So that's it in a nutshell. I
Mhm.
hope that was clear and not too much gobbledygook.
Yeah, it's not a small task, obviously.
No, it's
So
not.
it's I would like to understand, and for the audience as well, who are your you said you're the chair of a group, so who is working with you in that group?
Well, I was until recently. I think after 6 years, I thought that's enough doing that, so I stepped down. It was a very broad group of people taken from across Welsh society, so we didn't regard this as a technical design problem, but more as a social problem. So there were people representing landlords, people representing builders, people from all sorts of different walks of life, but all of whom had a strong interest in residential decarbonisation. It's not We don't see decarbonisation as principally a technical challenge. It does have technical attributes, but it's much more a social and an economic or financial challenge. We have to create an environment in which decarbonising a home is as socially normal as having a new kitchen installed by IKEA, for example.
So this, what you just mentioned, Chris, that relates again, one more about or to collaboration and how important that is. That all the sectors you said that it's not a technical issue; it's more a social issue and economical,
Mhm.
and that's critically important because if we don't tackle it from all the angles, we will never be able to solve the problem.
Yes, that's
So
correct.
I would like to understand from your point of view, having been working on this for many years, what are the main barriers for that to happen? From which of those different key
Okay,
stakeholders?
all right. I think cost is a very substantial barrier. Um, to decarbonize a home costs far more than it needs to, and we need to act together and deliberately to bring down costs. And there are precedents from around the world of how governments have acted to drive down costs very effectively by guaranteeing future sales to people who can meet technical and price requirements. The government of India did it with LEDs in the 2010s. The state of California did it with refrigerators in the 1980s. They said, this is the technical specification we want, and this is the price we're prepared to pay. If you can meet those, we'll buy everything from you. And the industry has responded in those cases, and it's possible, I think, and we need to do something similar to that to bring down the cost of decarbonising a home. So cost is a big one. Even then, because the price of electricity is so artificially high in relation to gas, government needs to act to bring down the price of electricity in relation to the price of gas. Because at the moment, if you just switch a house over from gas heating to air source heat pump heating, you'll probably pay a little bit more, or sometimes quite a lot more, for your heating. So that needs to be done, I think. Those are two very, very big barriers. Misinformation is another big barrier. There's a lot of just wrong information out there, and there are certain sectors of the media which still cast doubt on whether we need to do this or not, and that's certainly a barrier as well. When you look at the supply chains, the builders and the suppliers, they don't believe there is a good market for decarbonising homes. They'd rather stick with conservatories and stuff like that on homes, the conventional stuff, because they know there's a good and steady market there. So they don't get involved. They don't take the time, spend the money to train up their staff to be more skilled in decarbonisation, because they don't believe there is a future pipeline of work for them which will be profitable. So we need to act on that as well. So those are some of the big barriers.
Mm-hmm. And could it be that one of the reasons of the problems of cost are higher because people are not trained and there is not that steady pipeline? And if we had that pipeline, then it would be a more competitive market as well.
Absolutely. I talked to a Welsh manufacturer of heat pumps recently about this, and I said, what would you need in order to dramatically drive down the cost of the heat pumps you produce? And he said, we would need a single specification for the heat pump and guaranteed future sales of 25,000 heat pumps a year. It's
Okay,
not very much, really.
Okay.
When you think of what we need to do, we've got
Yeah,
25 million heat pumps installed in UK homes.
So that's exactly, so when you put it into perspective, sorry, it's not that much. And the other thing is, in that roadmap that you're talking about, so the level of, I think something else that you mentioned about media and everything is the awareness. So what would be the level of carbon savings that would be achieved with if Wales would follow that roadmap that you've
Well, I think it's a route to net zero. I think we can get there following that route. There's one other, that just reminds me, there's one other big barrier, and that is the targets that are set for the energy efficiency of homes by governments. One, they're expressed in terms of EPC, and that's not a good metric for setting decarbonising targets. EPCs were designed for a completely different purpose. Two, the targets are set so ambitiously that when people try to achieve them, they are discouraged by everything that they have to do to achieve those targets and the cost of doing that. There's a report came out in the summer called Retrofit at Scale by a group who were working with Letty and others, and they looked very closely into the impact of different targets on the cost of retrofitting a home. And they came up with what they called their basic retrofit, which doesn't nearly match some of the ambitious targets that government sets, but it makes a big dent in the carbon emissions from homes. And it's about 1/4 of the cost of the stuff that we're being encouraged to do. So we need to work hard, I think, at thinking the targets should be based on what people can afford to do, which links to bring down the cost so they can afford to do more.
What would be that basic retrofit that you just referred to? So for someone that is not an expert.
Oh gosh, well there's a bit of insulation, but not not stupid amounts everywhere. There's
Hmm.
a bit of draft proofing. There's enough insulation so that you don't have to replace the radiators and the pipework to take the lower temperature hot water that comes out of a low temperature air source heat pump. So
Hmm.
just a bit of that, bit of draft proofing, bit of mechanical ventilation. The heat pump gets installed. I mean, you probably stick a bit of PV on the roof. There's a little bit of sensible things to do, but it doesn't go over the top. That's the point. It's not You're not trying to achieve passive house or Enefit standards,
Hmm.
because they are in the current market certainly just unaffordable by
Yeah,
most people.
agree. And can that be done progressively? For example, you mentioned insulation, draft, PVs, heat pump. So if cost is a barrier, then if you think of a family at home, could they do the insulation first and the draft, then follow up with the heat pump and then the PV after? Is that, or by
Yes,
you addressing it at all at the
uh,
same time, with
I
fine?
think that you don't have to do everything in one go, certainly. You need to think carefully about what a sensible order is. If you're going to be doing some insulation and some draft proofing, for example, you really want to make sure that your house is still adequately ventilated so you don't cause
Mhm.
moisture
Yeah.
problems.
Yes.
But then you can follow that with an air source heat pump when your current gas boiler needs to be replaced.
Hmm.
You don't need to do it before. And some of these costs are costs which you would always have had to spend, because at some point your boiler will fall over.
Yeah.
It'll have to be replaced.
Yeah.
So it's just a heat pump instead of a gas boiler.
I think that's very sensible as well because it's not about exactly. So if you have a boiler that is 5 years old, it's not about throwing it to the bin. It's like do it progressively, and next time you do it. So
Yes.
that's I think because sometimes when people talk about it, is it costs a fortune because I have to do everything in one go. Boy, it's not that. It's being mindful about it and have your kind of timeline
Yes.
for your own house depending on how your house is fit. So I don't think it's a strategy that fits all houses. It depends on every single house and the conditions.
No, if you're rich and you want to move out of the house for a month while everything is, or 2 weeks while everything is done,
Mhm.
then by all means have everything done at one go. But for most of us, I think we would phase it in
Mhm.
over
Yeah.
2 or 3 years.
But I think it's also if we start looking and we add the embodied carbon to the mix, if there was, for example, a boiler that has been manufactured and there's some embodied carbon related to it, or even windows. So let's say your windows are not the best performance and they have to be improved. It's what is the impact of that embodied carbon that has been already it's already in the atmosphere because you placed them 5 years ago,
Hmm.
and now you learn that your windows could be better and you could achieve a better insulation and a better U value for your house. But that means you have to throw them to the bin, send for recycling, or find a second home versus a new window. So, what are your thoughts about that?
I would be inclined to keep whatever I've got in my house until it is time to replace it.
Okay, that's
That helps minimize the embodied carbon
mm,
that you generate with the replacements.
yeah. I think that's sensible. So, I wanted to check your opinion. So, going now back a bit in time. So, the first time I heard you talking about your work in Wales and the retrofitting was in 2019 when we were both at a panel discussion at the London Build Expo, and you were, it was encouraging to hear you talking about it, and we have to do this. So, and we are 2024, 5 years. So, what is your view of how much your message got there? How much is still to get there? What is the evolution that you've seen in the industry, and how much is left to be done?
Okay. Well, the good thing about being in Wales is Welsh government clearly understands the need to tackle climate change. It gets it, and it's trying to make sure that Wales tackles it in a well thought through, joined up way. There's no doubt about its commitment. It is, however, not a rich government. It relies on handouts from the Treasury every year, and they're never quite enough, it seems to me. But nevertheless, we gave it our recommendations in 2019, and it acted on particularly one of them, which was to have really large scale field trials from which it can collect useful data, so that that can inform future work. So it created something that it called the optimized retrofit program. It's a bit like the social housing decarbonisation fund in England, but it got there first, and it was better set up in terms of collecting data. So every home to which work was done, and about 5,000 homes in the first phase, no more actually, but at least 5,000 in the first phase. All those homes were well monitored so that every half hour their energy consumption, their internal environment, and so on were being recorded, so that later that can be analyzed and we can understand very well what works and what does not. It tried to collect cost data, but it was less successful about that. But nevertheless, an enormous amount of data has been collected and is being collected, which will inform future decisions. Now, this was aimed solely at the social housing landlords. The Welsh Government gave pro rata more generous grants to the Welsh social landlords than UK government did to the English social landlords, pro rata. And so they've been able to do really quite a lot with that. It's done 3 phases of the optimized retrofit program now. It's just finishing off the 3rd phase, and it's pausing while it thinks what to do next. So it's done that very well, and it did that through COVID, and COVID hit it very hard indeed, but it stuck to its guns and kept on doing it. It made implementing that program of that field trial very difficult, but nevertheless it continued through phase 1, phase 2, and now phase 3.
That's encouraging to
It's,
hear.
it's it's very encouraging. Yes, yes. I mean, you
And
look back
how,
and you
yes,
think, oh, we should have done things a little bit differently here or there, but overall, it's
yeah,
been a huge success, I think.
that's really good to hear. And how many homes you think oh, have been? How many homes have been retrofitted to not fully retrofitted because, as we said earlier, but how many of them have been improved?
Oh, well, I'm the biggest team that was involved was a thing called the Optimised Retrofit Consortium, and that engaged almost half the social landlords in Wales, and that has retrofitted about in phases 1 and 2. It didn't take part in phase 3. It's retrofitted 5,000 homes. So I should think if you double that to get all the other social landlords in and include phase 3, at least 10,000 homes have been retrofitted and are now being monitored. So
Mhm.
there's a big supply of data ready to be dug into and thought about. And there's other things going on in Wales as well. There's some fairly large scale thermographic scanning of vehicles been going on as well. And that's being added to the all Wales building stock model, which was created a few years back. So we have a computer model of every single building in Wales, not just houses, and we're slowly adding more and more and more data to it as that becomes
That's
available.
brilliant. That's brilliant. And what I'm thinking is, yeah, you're talking about Wales. How can that be extrapolated, or are you talking to similar initiatives in the rest of the UK or even Ireland and other European countries?
Yes, I chair a committee for DESNES, which is trying to maximize the learnings from the digital uplift part of SHDF. You know, SHDF gives money to local authority landlords to retrofit the homes, and digital uplift refers to that smaller section of landlords who are given extra money to monitor the energy and environmental behavior of those homes after the retrofit. And the steering group that I'm on, the purpose of it is to make sure maximum value is derived from that
Mhm.
data that's captured.
Thank you for that. And I want to ask you something a bit more personal now because, as I said earlier, I met you working as a structural engineer for
Yeah,
Arrow.
yeah,
The retrofit, so it was, I can't remember your job title exactly, but it was related to transformation of buildings, retrofitting,
yeah,
mainly focusing on existing buildings, wasn't it?
yes.
So, what was the exact job title? Sorry, if you can.
That my title then, I was Arup's global buildings retrofit leader. So
Okay,
my
so
job was to
retrofit.
make sure we did a good job everywhere,
So,
which is
and
difficult.
it was yeah, it was indeed, and but you were already a pioneer on that, let's say. But it was retrofitting on larger scale buildings normally, was it?
My particular interest was how we can work at scale. Because if you know, the Arup mantra of "We shape a better world,"
Mm.
you can't do that one building at a time when you've got in the UK, 30 million homes. You have to find ways of decarbonising them at scale. and it's a nice problem to have. That.
Hmm. Yeah. So then you retired as a structural engineer, and then you started working on the net zero, which is retrofit, but more what you've been talking about earlier doesn't involve much structure changes. It's mainly the fabric and
It,
MEP. So
it's the fabric and the systems in the building, and also but as I say, there are technical aspects to it, but the difficult bit is the human bit.
mhm. And so where did your interest? So you've been in the retrofit obviously for many years at Arup, and then you move to a different type of retrofit. So that's something you had been working before you retired as a structural engineer,
Yes,
or so you were doing both
yes.
things in parallel.
The interest in housing grew in my last, I don't know, my last decade at Arup probably.
Hmm.
That became stronger and stronger, and also my interest in the behavioural, in the social aspects of it. I teamed up with a group from the UCL Centre for Behaviour Change, and they informed a lot of what we did in Wales in the first report that we issued to Welsh government. They,
Hmm.
a lot of times historically when governments have engaged in behavior change, they've just focused on the group that they want to influence, and they've tried to incentivize them, they've tried to educate them, but they have not stepped back and realized that people don't act in isolation. They're influenced by many other people and organizations, and they create the environment in which it's easier or harder to do the right thing. So the work in Wales we're doing is very much focused on creating this enabling environment. So, estate agents do the right thing, small builders do the right thing, local authorities do the right thing, distribution network operators do the right thing, so that when a, a, a homeowner decides it's time to, so that the homeowner A decides, yes, I'd like to decarbonize my home. And then when he or she wants to do that, they find it really easy to do a good job.
Hmm. And thinking about all that, I guess we can't miss academia and third level students, second level students, because they will be the users of those homes in the near future. So are you engaging with students as well at
Um,
universities, second level?
um, Not particularly, actually. I mean, I still lecture from time to yeah. Via lectures, yes, quite a
Yes.
lot.
Okay.
Directly, certainly with academia, for example, the UCL Energy Institute. There's some planet-sized brains there working on this problem. Um, so generally with academia, yes, at arm's length with students, really.
Okay.
Yeah,
Because I
it
think it
should
would
do
be
more, I think, is the lesson there.
exactly. So I think it would be interesting if they hear more about this from you or your group, so then they can influence. Because at the end of the day, I think the more, and yes, you said it's a social. So the more people are able to help you to convey that message, the better. So yeah,
Yes, absolutely.
I thought there, because
Yes,
that's something we are trying to do as well at Sherwin Design, and trying to get younger and younger generations to get that message and push forward.
yes,
So
yes.
uh, on the that interest in the retrofitting and the energy and the heat pumps you've been talking about, that interest you said it grew up in you in the last decade, but you also studied something about physics back in the 80s. I read in your LinkedIn profile. Could
Yeah.
you tell us a bit and how that influenced what you're doing now?
Yes, back in the 80s, Arup and others were interested in very, very, very large scale enclosures. Um, Things in the jargon, they were called LCMEs, large climate moderating enclosures. You think of Buckminster Fuller's idea of a dome
Mhm.
over New York, that
Yeah.
sort of a scale. And we were starting to be asked by clients to look at buildings of that scale. We had a potential job in Alaska in Mount McKinley National Park about putting a roof over an entire valley in a
Wow.
national park. So it became clear that in order to do that, it wasn't just a structural challenge. You had to work out what the environment would be naturally inside those, and how you might be able to influence that by designing the enclosure properly. So Arup sent me to the University of Minnesota for a year to the graduate physics school to study atmospheric physics, cloud systems, I think, were the three courses. It's basically about the interaction of radiation and convection and conduction and convection, particularly of moist fluids, which is how the atmosphere works,
Mhm.
so that when you're designing a large enclosure, you've got a good handle on those, and then you can see what you can do to tune the fabric, to tune the enclosure so that the natural things that occur inside support what you're trying to do rather than fight against it.
That's very interesting, and I get that knowledge was your brain for all your career, and
Yes.
you're using all that now as well. So
Yes,
that's
so I mean, we're probably going to need that, particularly I think in as the hot arid regions of the Earth grow, which they have been doing for
Mhm.
some decades
Yeah.
now. I think we are going to need to make parts of them more habitable, if not for us, then perhaps for growing crops. So that work and that Minnesota work led on to the development of some designs which I call desert greenhouses, which were enclosures for hot arid climates, which um, made the interior cooler than the exterior, with no power, no moving parts. It's just we got the radiation right, we got the conduction right, we got the convection right, so that on the floor level in those enclosures, it was 10 to 15 degrees Celsius cooler inside than outside.
And that links, or at least it links in my mind to buildings as well. So I've seen often, and I'm sure you've seen this a lot as well, that because the design is not done correctly, then we have to make the MEP system works much
Yeah,
harder,
yeah,
and they are larger and they consume more energy because we didn't design it properly from the beginning. From the
yeah,
beginning, would
yes.
you agree with that?
Absolutely. I remember when we were working on the post building, there was a lot of discussion about the design of the glazing on the different elevations of the building so as to improve the energy performance of the building.
Mhm.
And you and your colleagues listened very carefully to that advice so that the glazing does have different properties on the east, west, north, and south faces. That reflects that, so the systems inside the building don't have to work nearly as hard as they would have if it had just been uniform glazing all around, which you see on rather too many buildings at the moment.
Uniform, and then in the worst case scenario, fully glazed, which then is it makes the problem even worse because you don't need that much daylight, but you bring all the problems and then overheating in summer and so on and so forth. So it's and that leads to a question: is what do you think? It's the level of responsibility of the designers. I know we are not talking about retrofitting now. It's more. It's this. Well, it's in retrofitting as well because if you are retrofitting and transforming an existing building, what you do with the fabric of that one, it's important as well. So, what do you think is the responsibility of the designers in all that process, and how designers could affect in a positive way how we build?
Well, we all have a responsibility to tackle climate change, and that extends into designers no less than anybody else, I think. So, I mean, in the end, you can only do what your client will allow you to do. And not all clients are open to this kind of thinking, though I think increasing numbers are, because the market values low energy buildings, low carbon buildings. Um, but yeah, there's a big responsibility on designers to help make it turn out right. Definitely, definitely.
And I think so. And you're right that there is a client always that there is a brief and everything. But I think as designers, we should also aim for the best and keep pushing and
Yes, yes,
not just assume that because sometimes what I found over my career as well is that the clients might not even be aware of some options that were available there and they might not have a cost increase. And once they are aware of it, then they might be. So first they have to be aware of it, and then second keen to integrate it. But the first one is to be aware. So that's why I think designers have a huge responsibility because they have the knowledge. So everything you've been talking about earlier, we need to be able to communicate that to the clients. If they are not aware, if they still say no, then fine. But at least we've tried.
yes. And you really need a united design team to do that. You can have the
Yeah,
engineer up to speed, you can have the architect up to speed, but for example, the cost consultant needs to be up to speed as well.
yeah.
If there's one dissenting voice, then it's quite easy for the client to say, "Oh, I'm not sure about that. I think we'll park that one."
I agree 100%. And that's a very important point as well. And that those conversations have to happen early. Again, going back to collaboration and everything, because it can take a lot of hard work thrown to the bin if someone dissents in a bit and say, "Oh yeah, all good. It will cost 10% more." That's it. End of the conversation.
Yes, I know a public sector organization. I better not name it, but at high level, the guidelines are clear that that organization needs to take account of carbon, embodied carbon in everything that it buys, and it buys a lot of stuff. And so the message goes down to the procurement people. You really must factor in carbon in your procurement decisions. But another instruction also finds its way to those people, which is you have to buy the cheapest, and
Yeah,
cheapest wins. So that,
and that's something we are finding every day. It's like that miscommunication. I would, if we put it nicely, between different parts of the same company or
yes,
body, government body, whatever it is. That on one hand they're saying this, on the other hand is that, and usually cost wins. That's how it works. So
yes, but these days, it's very clear, I think, that certainly look at commercial buildings and the route to 2050. If they are not as good as they can be environmentally, they will at some point be stranded assets,
yeah,
and they will lose value compared with their competitors.
yes, indeed,
And
and that's why
that's a powerful driver for somebody investing in a new building.
it is, and that's why the looking at the big picture is so important. Because if we look only at direct value, that's where some of the conversations happen. It's this against that. This one is 5-10% more expensive. We go for the other one. Yeah, but what happens after 10 years? Have
Yes.
you look at that and other benefits that might happen? Anyway, that's
Juan, can I
yeah,
just remembering the post building that you and
yes,
I worked on,
yes,
I
yes,
remember one of the
sure,
benefits of doing a retrofit compared with doing a new build
yes,
was that our client was allowed to a, generate a bigger floor area, which would
yeah,
generate greater rental income
yeah,
for him
yeah,
by reusing the existing building.
yeah,
If he'd knocked it down and built new, that would have probably cost him more, would
mhm,
certainly cost him more, but he wouldn't have been allowed to build so much.
yes,
So the economics lined up with the environment in that case.
yeah. And I think if you look at it carefully, most of the retrofits they will have a positive impact. And it will work from a cost point of view, I believe, because going back to the post building, and for those, I mean, we can share a link after we might share a link to that project in the when we publish the podcast. It only the foundation, if I remember, you remember better than me. I think it was 1.5 meters deep, the
Yes.
foundation. So the volume of concrete, the steel tonnage of that, if you do a quick calc,
Yeah.
is just impressive. So only by saving that, it's massive. So anyway, just to finalize, what would be? I think it's really I don't know, like reconforting to see someone like you pushing. So we need more people like you to be doing what you are
Thank you.
doing. So
Kind of
what
you to
not
say
in
so.
your career, but also like and even I'm sure it takes a lot of your personal time as well, not only your working hours too, because at the end of the, I think it's a way of living as well, and a way of understanding life. So what would be the message you would send to younger generations about what they can do and how they can help to make a positive impact?
Oh goodness. I've never thought of myself as somebody who ought to advise younger generations. Um, I mean, we've got to tackle climate change is my message, I think. And it starts at home, but it expands into everything one does at home and at work. You've just got to, we cannot keep pumping carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. We have to stop doing that. And we have to stop doing that as fast as possible. And that's down to all of us.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Thank you very much, Chris. It's been a pleasure talking to
Thank
you
you,
after
Juan.
a few years, and I will keep looking at the good work you're doing, and hopefully the work you're doing will influence more, as we said, across the UK and across Europe and elsewhere.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye bye.